Hello. This fabulous Friday. We are on the last day of our book. Super exciting. So today's the day that you tell me what you learned about the vocabulary, and then, we'll finish up our story. So tell me what knelt, rudder, staff, tapestry, trudged, column, and norns are. Okay, so Jack and Annie managed to get the Ice Wizard's eyeball yesterday out of the cave of the Frost Giant. They didn't see the Frost Giant, but he did bury them in snow, and they woke up to the white wolves around them. Annie thinks the wolves are being friendly. Jack freaked out and threw snow at them until they ran away. And now they are headed back to see the Ice Wizard so that we can figure out what really kind of went on, and hopefully they can rescue Merlin and Morgan. Alright, Chapter 8, Return of the Eve. Jack and Annie walked through the front hall of the palace, past the ice columns, and into the wizard's throne room. The walls and floor glittered under the brilliant, cold light of dawn. "Ugh," said Jack. The wizard was waiting, and the two wolves were sleeping on either side of his throne. Jack was confused. Why are they here, he wondered. Do they belong to the wizard? The wolves lifted their head and sniffed the air. Their ears pricked up. When they caught sight of Jack and Annie, they sprang to their feet and stared at them with piercing yellow eyes. The Ice Wizard was staring at Jack and Annie, too. "Well," he said, "did you bring back my eye?" "Yep," said Jack. Annie took the hailstone out of her pocket and held it to the wizard. Jack watched the wolves nervously as the hailstone passed from Annie's small hand into the wizard's large, rough hand. The wizard stared at the chunk of ice. Then he looked at Jack and Annie. "Indeed, you are heroes," he said. "Not really," said Jack. The wizard looked again at his eye inside the hailstone. Then, with a quick movement, he slammed the ice chunk against the arm of his throne. Jack and Annie gasped and stepped back. The wizard slammed the hailstone again. This time, the ice cracked. The wizard gently pried his eye out of the heart of the hailstone. He lifted the frozen eyeball into the air and studied it. Then, with an eager cry, he ripped off his eye patch. Jack and Annie watched in amazement as the wizard fitted his eye into the dark socket. Jack held his breath. He was kind of horrified, but also fascinated. He couldn't imagine someone just shoving an eyeball back into their head. The wizard lowered his hand. He seemed to be holding his breath. He had two eyes now, but the new one didn't move. It looked like it was frozen. Jack was worried. If the eye didn't work, the wizard might not help. "Well, we brought you your eye," he said. "So, can you tell us where Merlin and Morgan are?" The Ice Wizard jerked his head to look at Jack. He covered his one eye with his hand, then the other. In a frenzy, he went back and forth, covering and uncovering each eye. Finally, the wizard dropped his hand and roared, "No!" His howl shook the columns. "You tricked me!" "No, we haven't," said Annie. "This eye is useless," said the wizard. "It has no life, no sight." "Well, that's the one you gave to the Norns," said Annie, "and you promised that if we brought it back, you'd give me Morgan and Merlin." The two white wolves threw their heads back and howled. "No!" cried the wizard. "You tricked me! You tricked me!" "Let's just get out of here," said Jack, and he pulled Annie back towards the ice columns. "Stop," said the wizard. "You cannot escape me." He grabbed Merlin's staff of strength. The wolves growled and yelped. The wizard pointed the staff at Jack and Annie, and he started to say a spell. Why do you think his eyeball isn't working? Other than the fact that it's a frozen eyeball. "Wait!" someone yelled. Teddy burst into the throne room. "Wait!" The wizard held his staff in the air, and he stared at Teddy, his face twisted with rage. "We've got something for you," said Teddy. "Kathleen!" Kathleen stepped out from behind the ice columns. With her was a young woman with long braids. She wore a flowing white dress, and around her shoulders was a white feathered cloak. Her eyes rested on the wizard, and a radiant smile spread across her face. She began walking towards the throne. The wizard lowered Merlin's staff of strength and stared at the woman. All color drained from his face. For a long moment he was still as a statue. Then an ice-blue tear leaked out of his eye and ran down his cheek. Jack and Annie stood with Kathleen and Teddy and watched the young woman and the Ice Wizard gaze at each other. "Is she his sister? Is that the Swan Maiden?" whispered Annie. "Yes," said Kathleen. The Swan Maiden spoke to the Ice Wizard in a strange language, Velio Venoan. The wizard did not answer. Tears flowed now from both eyes. "Velio Venoan," the Swan Maiden said again. That's what she looks like. "What's she saying?" Jack said. "She said, "I've come back to forgive you," said Kathleen. The wizard stood up and gently walked down the steps of the throne. He gently touched the Swan Maiden's face, as though to make sure she was real. Then he answered her softly in the language, Felawon. "How did you find her?" Jack asked Teddy. "A seal took us under the ice to the Isle of the Swans," said Teddy. "When we found her, I told her how much the wizard missed her," said Kathleen. "I also told her about the two of you and how you always help each other. I told her she should return to her brother and learn how to be his friend again." The wizard and his sister kept speaking softly to each other in their language. Warm sunlight streamed through the palace window. Annie stepped forward. Excuse me," she said. The wizard looked at her. "My sister has returned home," he said. "I can see with both eyes now. I see perfectly." "I am glad," said Annie, "but now you must give us Merlin and Morgan." The wizard looked at his sister, and she nodded. He held out the Merlin staff of strength. "Use this to bring them back," he said. "Hold it tightly and call for them." He gave it to Annie. Annie could barely lift it. "Hold it with me, Jack," she said. Jack stepped forward and grabbed the magic staff. The smooth golden wood felt warm and vibrant in his hands. As they gripped the staff together, Annie threw back her head and shouted, "Merlin and Morgan, come back!" A burst of blue light shot out of the end of the staff and flashed towards the two white wolves. Suddenly, the wolves' eyes changed to human eyes, their noses to human noses, their mouths to human mouths, wolf ears to human ears, wolf paws to human hands and feet, wolf fur into long red cloaks. The two white wolves were gone, and a man and a woman stood in their place. Did anybody guess that that's who the white wolves were? I didn't the first time I read this. Chapter 9, Wisdom of the Heart. "Merlin Morgan!" cried Annie. Kathleen and Teddy, I'm mixing it up today. Teddy and Kathleen cried in amazement. Annie rushed to Morgan and hugged her, and Jack was filled with giddy relief. "Hey," he said. "Hi." "Welcome back, sir," Teddy said to Merlin. "Thank you," said Merlin. He looked at Jack and Annie. "And thank you for turning us back into ourselves." "We didn't know you and Morgan were the wolves," said Annie. "We were following you so we could help you," said Morgan. "The wizard told us if you caught us, you would eat us," said Jack. "Really?" Morgan said. They looked at the ice wizard. Standing with his sister, he stared guiltily at Morgan and Merlin. "I worried if they got too close to you, they would discover you," he said. "But I will do no more harm, I promise. I can see clearly now." The wizard looked at his sister, and his eyes shone with joy. "You can see because you have your heart back," said Morgan. "It is not only your eye that was missing, it was your heart. We see with our hearts and our eyes. And now perhaps you can find the wisdom you were seeking from the Norns," said Merlin, "for wisdom is knowledge learned with the heart as well as the head." The ice wizard nodded. "Please find it in your heart to forgive me," he said. "Use my sleigh to take you safely home." "Yes, indeed, we must leave," said Morgan. "We have been gone from Camelot for far too long." "The next time you come to Camelot, my friend, you must come as a guest," said Merlin, "not a thief in the night." "Indeed I will," said the wizard. Merlin looked at Jack, Annie, Teddy, and Kathleen. "Everyone ready?" he asked. "Yes, sir," they all answered. Merlin looked at the staff of strength. "Oh, almost forgot," said Jack. He handed the staff to Merlin. As soon as Merlin held the staff, he seemed more powerful. "Let us be off," he said briskly. They led the way out of the throne room, red cloaks billowing behind them. Teddy and Kathleen followed, and then Jack and Annie behind. Just before they left the room, Jack and Annie glanced back at the ice wizard and his sister. They were deep in conversation. "They haven't seen each other in years," said Annie. "They must have a lot to talk about." "Yeah," said Jack. He couldn't imagine not seeing Annie for years. "Come on, let's go," he said. He took her hand and pulled her out of the throne room, through the front hall, and into the cold dawn. Jack and Annie followed their 4 Camelot friends to the wizard's sleigh. Everyone climbed in. Annie sat at the rudder, and Jack stood at the front. He pulled out the windstring and untied a knot. The sleigh rocked forward. He untied another, and the sleigh started moving. The sleigh was heavier than before, so Jack quickly untied 2 more, and it bolted across the snow. "Stand fast," said Teddy. As the sleigh swished through the dawn, Annie turned to Merlin and Morgan. "I have a question," she said. "Can you tell us what the giant looks like? The frost one, I mean." Merlin smiled. "There is no frost giant," he said. "What?" said Teddy and Kathleen. Yeah, there is," said Annie. "We heard him breathing." "He nearly froze us to death," said Jack. "At night, the wind swirls through the hollow hill like a cyclone," said Merlin. "You experienced one of those storms. But what about the Norn story of giving the wizard's eye to the frost giant?" "Many ancient peoples believed that the forces of nature were giants and monsters," said Morgan. "The Norns are the last of their kind. They hold to the idea that the frost giant is actually a living creature in the hollow hill. In truth, The frost giant didn't accept their gift because there is no frost giant. Jack shook his head. We believed what they believed. They told us that we'd freeze if we looked directly at it. And we believed what the wizard said Annie, that the wolves would eat us if they caught us. People often try to convince us that the world is scarier than it is, said Morgan. Right now, the world didn't seem scary to Jack. Everything was calm and bright. Soft rose-colored light was breaking through the morning cloud. Today is the first day after the winter solstice, said Morgan. Today the light returns and the days grow longer. Jack looked to the sun. He caught sight of the treehouse on top of a snowdrift not far away. He tied a knot in the windstring and then 3 more, and the sleigh came to a stop at the foot of the snowdrift. Merlin looked at them. On the winter solstice you showed great courage, he said. You endured storms, terror, and extraordinary cold. You reunited the Ice Wizard and the Swan Maiden, and perhaps most importantly, you retrieved my Staff of Strength. I thank you. Sure, said Jack and Annie modestly. You've done much for the kingdom of Camelot on your last mission, said Merlin. On your next adventure you will have a mission back in your world, and in real time, not in the time of myth and legend. We'll call for you soon, said Morgan. Great, said Annie. They climbed out of the sleigh and looked at Teddy and Kathleen. I hope you'll be with us on our next journey, Annie said. Teddy smiled. If we all work together, we can do anything, eh? He said. Aye, said Jack and Annie together. Then they turned and trudged up the snowdrift. At the top, they climbed into the window of the treehouse, and when they were inside, they looked back. The sleigh was already gone. Bye, Annie said softly. Jack picked up the small gray stone and pointed to the words Frog Creek in the message. I wish we could go there, he said. The wind started to blow. It blew harder and harder. Then everything was still. Absolutely still. Jack opened his eyes. They were back in the Frog Creek woods. No time at all had passed. It was almost twilight, and snowflakes fell like tiny feathers outside the treehouse window. Annie shivered. I'm cold, she said. Here, take my scarf, said Jack. No, you need it, said Annie. Nah, it'll be okay, said Jack. He put his scarf around Annie's neck. What are you going to tell Mom when she asks about your scarf? He asked. I'll just tell her the Sisters of Fate took it as payment for telling us how to find the eye of the Ice Wizard in the hole of Hollow Hill, she said. Right, said Jack, laughing. We'd better get home before dark, said Annie. She started down the rope ladder, and Jack followed. When they got to the ground, he remembered the wind string. We forgot to give this back, he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled it out. I guess Merlin's magic took the sleigh back to Camelot. Jack and Annie looked at the string. Untie a knot, Annie whispered. Jack took off his gloves and untied a knot. He held his breath and waited. Nothing happened. He gave Annie a little smile. I guess in our world, it's just a piece of string, he said. They put the string back in his pocket and started walking over the snowy ground between the trees. As they walked, Jack kept a lookout for Teddy and Kathleen's footprints, but they were gone. They moved out of the woods and down the street. They saw a Christmas tree light sparkling in people's houses and candles shining in windows. The boots squeaked as they crossed the snow-covered yard. When they got to the stairs, Jack stopped and stared in astonishment. Annie's red woolen scarf was draped over the railing on the porch. I don't believe it, said Jack. I do, said Annie. They hurried up the stairs, and Annie grabbed her scarf. Look, she said. She held up the scarf to Jack. There was now a tiny picture woven into it, a picture of him and Annie and 2 white wolves. Jack was speechless. Cool, huh, said Annie. She gave Jack back his scarf and then tied her scarf around her neck. She tucked the part with the picture under her jacket collar. The front door opened. A delicious smell wafted out from the house. Hi, said their mom. Their cookies are ready. Come inside and get warm. And that's where we're going to stop for today. So, a note from the author. She says a lot of the parts of this story are come from a lot of ancient Norse myths. In fact, she said she actually wrote a book called Favorite Norse Myths, and she retold a lot of stories of the Viking people. And she used some of those elements in this story. So, for example, there's a Norse myth that tells about a god named Odin who traded his eye for wisdom. There are stories about frost giants, and also 3 sister goddesses known as the Norns who decide people's fates. In Greek mythology, they're called the Fates themselves. In doing further research, she also came across swan maidens, who could turn into swans, and the wind string. She also says that wind strings were mentioned in the original Snow Queen story, which is Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. So she says this kind of wraps up these stories that were all inspired by Irish legends. And she says that the cauldron of memory and imagination, the diamond of destiny, the sword of light, and the staff of strength are 4 things inspired by the 4 hallows of Camelot, which were the 4 most sacred gifts of the ancient Celtic people. So yeah, a lot of this is all tied into Celtic myth and legend, and I've actually ordered a bunch of books for myself so I can read and do more research on this stuff because I think it's really cool. So anyway, yeah, that is all I have for you today, and we will be back with number 33, Carnival at Candlelight. Okie dokie. Bye guys. Have a great Friday.